Back here now on the show to talk about the Houston Texans a little bit here, and specifically the running back Joe Mixon. I think certainly it's gonna sound funny because the Texans are 4-1. It doesn't feel like they're needing anybody to come back, right? They've had just as good a start as anybody. But if you guys looked at the first couple weeks and how Joe Mixon was playing, he was really he was really going off, but I think what he was doing to the Houston Texans, really completing them. Whereas now, Cam Akers, their other running back, who I'm not even going to try to pronounce his last name, they're doing all right, but I feel like still, it feels like something's missing, especially after seeing the first 2 weeks by Joe Mixon and how well he was doing. He recorded like almost 160 yards on the ground against the Colts that first week, and really right off of the bat, he hit the ground running with this team, and I felt like he completed them quite perfectly. But unfortunately, he suffered that injury, and we haven't seen him since week 2 against the Chicago Bears, where unfortunately he injured his ankle because of a hip drop tackle from Chicago's TJ Edwards. And because of that, the latest update that we have on Joe Mixon was that he returned to practice yesterday, and I haven't seen any updates on it, but he said he was supposed to practice today, and then he would give more of an inclination of whether or not he was going to play or not this upcoming Sunday and make his return. So that's exciting to at least see him back on the field, but he has missed about a month now with that injury, and obviously Joe Mixon was upset about it because the NFL made it a big deal this entire offseason, right, with the idea that hip drop tackles were going to make it impossible for the defense. Everyone was freaking out online, saying how the refs were just going to be throwing flags all over the place, and it was going to be really bad for the defenders, right? But up until now, I haven't seen any live games that I've been watching anything be stopped for a hip drop tackle or anything like that. So it's been quite the opposite of what people thought, but because of that, the idea is to still outlaw this tackle, right? They want to get it out of the NFL, but I haven't seen that many flags be thrown, other than maybe one, I think, and I don't really remember what it was, but I feel like I've seen one. But regardless of that, this one was one of the more obvious ones, and ironically, this tackle by TJ Edwards on Joe Mixon was one of the ones not called. It seemed like the most obvious, but it was not called. Instead, they just fined TJ Edwards $16,000 afterwards, and that's important for a later point that we're going to bring up. But people thought that this was going to be a big deal, like I said, and until right now, we haven't really seen it, completely take over in games, which I think is good. You don't want that, obviously, to happen, but it felt like the refs were going to be a bit more strict about it, or at least call the ones that were obvious, like this one with TJ Edwards and Joe Mixon. And of course, the it feels so ironic and so frustrating, you'd imagine, for Joe Mixon, because they made such a big deal out of it, and when the moment comes for you to throw the flag, they don't throw the flag, and Joe Mixon's now sidelined for a month, and TJ Edwards is only fined $16,000. For context, for the players, it isn't that much, but still, it's frustrating, right, to say the least, right, for a guy like Joe Mixon. And he made that evident in some of his recent social media activity when last week the NFLPA's Twitter account, X account, whatever you'd like to call it, posted something about the recent media access debate, right, about whether or not media should do interviews in the locker room. I'm sure you guys have heard about it. Mixon replied to that Twitter account, and he said that player safety is what matters and should be the focus, not media access. And then yesterday, he spoke with the media in one of his press conferences during, or actually after practice, I want to say, and he had this to say to kind of vent his frustrations a little bit, like he did on Twitter, but now also directly to the media. He said, I was the number one leader in rushing. I was stopped because of that weak, fill in the blank, hip drop tackle. I can't do nothing about it. It's frustrating. It is what it is. And then after that, Joe Mixon really went off on a tangent, right? To talk about not only his frustrations with the hip drop tackle not being flagged and only fining TJ Edwards $16,000, but also he went on to kind of mention how the whole fine system it's sort of backwards, right? In his opinion, on how he was kind of stressing it in this next statement. He said that the fines to guys like Josh Jacobs, like Zach Charbonnet for the Seattle Seahawks, for Nico Collins also. I'm not sure if you guys have seen it. These instances where they called unnecessary roughness on the offensive player, the running back, like say Josh Jacobs, right? There was a game I want to say against the Colts where he was sort of running directly at a defender, and he just tucked his head like this, and it made contact with the defender first, and they called him for unnecessary roughness, or at least they fined him. They fined him a lot of money for that hit, and we're getting to a point now where we're calling unnecessary roughness, or we're fining players a lot on offense for unnecessary roughness calls. We're entering a new territory now of kind of the level of ridiculousness that this is getting to with some of these calls. And Joe Mixon clearly wasn't a fan of that either, and he went off on a spiel here. If you guys just bear with me here and see what he says. He goes, you got guys out here protecting themselves from hits, and they are getting fined $45,000 and $50,000, and for an illegal hip drop tackle, they're getting fined $16,000 when it's supposed to be an emphasis. It's supposed to be taken out of the game, and so obviously the priorities ain't right with what's going on, and I would agree with him. You know, the question of, is he making sense? Is this a valid point to have now? And is it something worth talking about with not just the hip drop tackles and the player safety, but also the idea of the amount of flags that we're seeing? I feel like, because it's not only the fines and not calling the hip drop tackles, it's the idea of everything else around it, right? The context with what it comes with. Because I'm seeing NFL players being fined, being, not ridiculed, but, being called out, I guess, by the NFL by these fines, like Alan Lazard, right? He had his first down celebration. He was kind of like pointing like this or something, kind of signaling a first down, and it's resembled, like a gun, I guess you could say, a firearm, if you will, and they fined him a lot of money for that, and it seems so ridiculous that the priorities, like Joe Mixon says, right? They're really focusing and trying to lock down these celebrations, right, that resemble firearms or that look like someone shooting something like a gun with their hands or something like that, or a bow and arrow or something like that. Any weapon-like thing. It feels like the NFL are really to the T on trying to take that out of the game. And I understand if it's so obvious, throw the flag, fine them, whatever you want. But if it's, I don't think it should be that overblown, right? They've got to chill a little bit with some of these flags. And if they do find them, I don't think it should be anywhere near what we're seeing for that hip drop tackle, right? Because now we're talking about the context and how they relate. If a hip drop tackle is 16,000, and that's a big problem, right? Because you need these players to be healthy, obviously, right? Not being injured by these sort of tackles. That should be one of the highest fines probably in, their fine system, right? Not 16,000. And then for other guys, like we mentioned with Josh Jacobs and Zach Charbonnet and Nico Collins, bracing themselves as a natural reaction, as a natural instinct to potentially a big hit from a defender, and they're the ones getting called for unnecessary roughness or getting fined $50,000. It shouldn't be that big of a difference, first of all, and if anything, it shouldn't really be called at all or fined at all, finable offense at all. To compare that to the hip drop tackle and have it be $30,000 more for, bracing yourself for a big hit, that makes no sense, and it feels like it's backwards to me. For players to get low and brace themselves and not be vulnerable to a big hit by just standing up straight and holding their head up like this, they're more of at a risk of getting hit and hurting themselves, right? If they're just running up like this and their head's up, not tucking it down and bracing for a big hit, that makes no sense, and it feels like the NFL is prioritizing, like Joe Mixon said, other silly things than prioritizing, one of their bright stars in Joe Mixon as a running back, finding a way to take those hip drop tackles out. They didn't throw a flag on the play, so it didn't affect the game at all. And also, TJ Edwards was only fined $16,000. So it feels like they're not looking at the right situations appropriately, and they're being too overbearing with some. And the other ones that need the most attention, they're not really getting that at this point in time. And, that it seems like not a lot of people are talking about it too much. It's always about the celebrations, which seems pretty ridiculous. And the media access one is interesting. That one I would disagree with, but I think this one's a bigger one. That Joe Mixon, I would say that he is right, and it feels like the NFL is hovering and just trying to find these guys some way, shape, or form to fine them for silly things like celebrations. Which, again, if they're too over the top, then yeah, it makes sense. But if they're barely anything, or if they could be interpreted any which way, don't make it seem like they're like shooting a firearm or something like that. Like, it's not a case of they should be allowed to do anything, but like, come on, we gotta like reel it in a little bit more if you're the NFL, and maybe pay attention to some of these hip drop tackles or anything like that. We don't want it to be overbearing as well. Let's find a happy medium here with these calls and the player safety and things like that. I thought Joe Mixon made a very good point, and in comparing those two finable offenses, and it seems backwards to me, honestly, that he was hurt, nothing really came about it, and he's had to miss a month where, like he said, he was leading the NFL in rushing and could have been on his way to one of the best years of his career. He still could do that, but it's a month removed now, so it's unfortunate. Hopefully he comes back and plays this week and we can see him back out there on the field. But that was something I wanted to highlight because it was certainly interesting to me how he brought that up. But we're going to move on now from the Houston Texans, leave that there for a second, and come back after the break and talk about the Eagles. They're coming off of their bye week. Jalen Hurts had some things to say in his press conference leading up to this game against the Browns on the improvements he wants to make, a meeting that he had with Nick Sirianni during their bye week to address some of the off-the-field things. That is coming up right after this break. We'll be right back.